everyone. I'm usually used to relaying this information to about 15 people in an 8x10 room. So this is really kind of a different climate for me. But over the course of the next few months, there are going to be a series of talks kind of delving into each of the groups that I'm going to look at more specifically. But I'm going to be touching on 5 major patterns of immigration and how they related not only to the development of this neighborhood, but New York as a whole, and also how they may have related to the lives of our families who would be living within this area. So, sponsored by the Merchant's House. How many of you have been to the Merchant's House, just out of curiosity? So many of you. I love this house. I love this house because it's survived New York City, essentially. Right. You know, it's always been a creature, the reinvention that tears itself down and builds itself up again, and this just bore witness to all of that. And I'll just kind of go over a little bit of basic information for those of you who have not yet visited this fantastic building. But it was essentially a private family home for almost a century before becoming a museum directly after. It was built in 1832, but the family that moved in here in 1835 was the Treadwells. The patriarch of whom was named Seabury Treadwell, came here in 1798 from Long Island to seek his fortune in the merchant trade. And he mostly dealt with hardware, nails, metal door hinges, and had a really good time of it. Because by the time he was in his 40s, he had enough to retire. He purchased this home to be a kind of fall and winter residence for his family, and that family moved here in 1835. Seabury, his wife Eliza, 5 daughters, 2 sons, with a 6th daughter being born in 1840. And they're coming into the Bond Street area, this pastoral, exclusive suburb where if you were anybody, you were living here. Where all the merchant princes of New York were kind of finding their communities. And it took a little bit to develop. I love a good map. This is 1789 New York. So essentially, I think I have a little laser pointer here. This is farmland, mostly by James Delancey, Henry Rutgers. The city proper extended basically to Worth Street and that's it, like City Hall Park area. A lot of Manhattan is concentrated right in the tip of the island, and this is where we start to see a lot of commercial development. By the time the Erie Canal is opened in 1825 and paves the way for New York becoming this major leading port, that waterfront gets more commercial, it gets more bustling, and we start to see these well-to-do families of New York pushing northwards. So, 1834, we get massive development in New York. This little red line is the boundary of 1789 and just what happened within the span of 40 years. And the neighborhood that we're going to be focusing on is this little shape here, the Bond Street area, which essentially went from Bowery to Broadway and from Bleecker to Astor Place, which at this point is Art Street. And that neighborhood was developed by German immigrant John Jacob Astor I. He was born in Waldorf near Heidelberg, Germany. As a teenager, he worked for an uncle in London, kind of manufacturing musical instruments, but he came to New York after the American Revolution, 1783, and initially got into fur trading. That later enabled him to turn an eye to real estate in the early 20th century, or 19th century, and he started buying up huge swaths of real estate in New York. By the 1820s, wealthiest man in the country. His family became known as the landlords of New York, and one of the first sort of regions he started to develop was this area. He buys a nice little pleasure garden, Vauxhall Garden in 1804 he buys it, not to be confused with the London Vauxhall Gardens. But this was a little oasis in the area that was leased by a French distiller and confectioner named Jacques Delacroix. And our wealthy New Yorkers could promenade through these dappled, leafy walks. There were musical productions, theatrical productions they could watch. They could eat ice cream here. And when Astor purchased it, he allowed Delacroix to kind of keep this pleasure garden. By 1809, the city ended up paving Broadway up to about this area. And then by 1825, Delacroix's lease expires, and Astor decides to develop the neighborhood further. He ends up cutting Lafayette Place right through that pleasure garden. And by the 1820s, we get sites like this, the Lagrange Terrace, also known as Colonnade Row, this massive marble monolith. And there's a couple bits of it that still remain now, Blue Man Group Theater. But alongside these kind of very exclusive row houses, you get a number of other properties like the Merchant's House. You have all these patrician homes rising up in the area, and within those homes you have this emerging genteel lifestyle of, again, wealthy merchant class New Yorkers. And it's a lifestyle that cannot function without the existence of domestic service. And the first kind of pattern of immigration we start to see in large, major numbers here in New York are often the face of that domestic service, and it is Irish immigration. A lot of people kind of cite the potato famine as being one of the driving factors for Irish immigration in the 1840s, and that is absolutely true. But there are also a lot of factors leading up to that, of centuries of disenfranchisement, a number of natural and man-made disasters that create the climate for the famine to have as devastating effect as it did. And that stretches back into the 16th, 17th centuries, where you have penal laws come about that impose fines, imprisonment for practicing Catholics in Ireland or Britain. Certain Catholic priests, if they were found practicing their ministry, sometimes they could be met with a death penalty. And adding to this imposition, there was also a lack of political voice. There were restrictions on who could own property as a Catholic, on certain occupations you could have as a Catholic, and 80% of Ireland was Catholic. And so these laws had a massive effect on a very large population. 1798, there was an Irish rebellion against English rule, but it was quickly squashed. And 2 years afterwards, through a British Act of Union, we see Ireland kind of folded into Britain's Parliament. And that abolishes a 500-year-old independent parliament in Dublin. There is Irish representation in Parliament, but it's 100 people and none of them are Catholic. So there's still this large voice that's going unheard and not really having a say in the decisions that are going to be made. And to add to that, there's also in the 1820s growing population, but not an economy in Ireland that's really growing alongside it. There's industrialization happening over in England, specifically in textile industries, where all of the Irish hand looms can't compete with the new technologies developing there, so that industry starts to crumble. You also have a lot of laborers having a very hard time finding regular work in the 1820s and 1830s. Irish labor, on average, in this period, would find about 3 months of work out of the year, a day a week of work. And at the end of a year, he'd make maybe $8 to $13. So this pre-famine migration that starts to happen is initially men coming over as laborers, coming to America and mostly being involved in public works projects. And that is who starts shaping New York, who starts digging the ditches and laying the roads, and also creating, elements like the Erie Canal. This really opened up New York. It opened it up to all of this inland trade and suddenly made New York this focal point in that conversation of trade. It enabled people like Seabury Trouble and people like his neighbors to make that fortune, and it was largely built at the hands of Irish immigrants. There were a lot of canal songs that kind of emerged around this period too in the early 19th century through the voices of Irish immigrants, where essentially they take Irish folk melodies but then readapt the lyrics to speak to the experience of working on the canal. Unfortunately, I don't have internet access, because that's a fancy little video I usually play for you. But there's some lyrics there to kind of give you a sense of the narrative that's talking about the labor of going through this work, the regret of going through that work as well. But you can look it up on your own because there's a lot of renditions that happen as a result. But it's this very strong musical tradition that Irish immigrants were bringing with them that kind of changed with that experience of living in this country and shaping this country. And I'm going to come back to Irish music in a little bit as far as perception with this larger kind of American populace. But coming back to Ireland, those of our laborers who didn't come over here and work in public works projects, another way to find money was essentially leasing land that they were tenants on for cash crops. Most of the Irish tenants didn't actually own the land they were living on. They were owned by English landlords. And so, what would happen is they'd use a large plot of land to grow corn, or to grow wheat that would later be exported to England. As a result, you have a very small plot to grow for your own food, and potatoes were a really great crop for that. because they have a really high nutritional value. They also produce a huge yield with just a small plot of land, and so a lot of Irish farmers return to potatoes for that food source. Potato blight comes through, though, in basically 1845 to 1852, and it wipes out 90% of that potato population. And you have tenants who are penniless and who are selling off their belongings to try and pay for their rent. You have mass evictions starting to happen on these farms. You have mass starvation. Even though food is still being grown in Ireland, it's being exported. And so around this is when we start to see this exodus. And the exodus kind of happened in one of two ways. For the earliest Irish immigrants that were starting to come during the famine period in the 1840s, specifically around the 5 Points neighborhood, kind of a half-mile to the southwest of us by City Hall Park area, the counties that came first were County Sligo, Kerry, and Cork. And a lot of those counties had land that was owned by English tenants who would pay to send Irish to North America, the most destitute, because it was cheaper to pay a one-time fee, send people across the ocean, rather than implement support systems and pay the taxes on those. So that was what kind of happened first, but it was only about 6% of the migration. For families who were a little more well off and could afford the 2 to 5 pounds to send a family member overseas, they would usually look to one of their young sons or daughters to do that and send a 15-year-old across the ocean. And a kind of nerve-wracking experience where not only are you 15 coming to this space with no support system, but the idea is not only you coming here to support yourself, but you're going to send money home. You're going to bring the rest of your family over into chain migration. So you'd also have that burden of responsibility on your shoulders as well. And it was a very young migration. In famine period, about 45% of the Irish immigrants who were coming into America at that point were between the ages of 15 to 24. And it was also a more female migration than others that we saw in that decade. Over half of them were coming as young girls. And so while our Irish men are largely finding work in labor and factory, we find young women working mostly in domestic service. About 60% of Irish women find homes or work within domestic service. This is our lovely view of the Merchant's House parlor. And this family had 4 servants that are employed at any given time. They're almost exclusively young Irish women. And it was in some ways a viable option for a young girl coming over. There were employment agencies set up by the city, set up by religious institutions as well. And the demand for domestic service was so high that a girl could come to New York at noon and she would find a job by 3. Within this space, it's domestic labor all day. She'd make about $4 to $8 a month, but she wouldn't have to pay for living expenses. You didn't have to pay for rent in a space like this. You'd be eating similar food to the family. The girl would also be living in a room, probably in the upper floors, with another Irish Catholic teenager, so there might be this familiarity among them in some respects. And there was also a little bit of agency, because the lady of the house, who's depending on this girl, has to train her into how to use a coal-burning stove, how to manage the running of a household. And after about 6 months here, maybe she says, the neighbors are going to give me an extra $1 every month. And the alternative would be to give her that extra $1, because otherwise you're going to have to train another girl all over again. So there was some flexibility in this. But at the same time, we have an Irish Catholic teenager working in the home of likely a wealthy Protestant, kind of native-born New Yorker. And there's no way to know how the Treadwells specifically would have related to their city changing around them, would have related to new people coming in. But if we look at the media from the time period that had an art audience of middle, upper-class New Yorkers, there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiments. A lot of illustrations characterizing the Irish in a sort of animalistic fashion. There were a lot of mindsets towards the Irish in some ways carrying over from English mindsets, but also levied upon them because of the context of their arrival, where essentially most of the Irish coming in this period are coming as refugees from the famine, with not a lot of money, severely malnourished. A lot are coming with skill in agriculture, where there's not nearly enough demand to really supply that population. And of course, they're also coming with this strange, un-American religion of Catholicism. And the question is, how can you be loyal to the country and be loyal to the Pope at the same time? And so all of these factors may have been shaping how these Irish women were relating to their employers and the power structures within that. But at the same time, a lot of Americans may not have been fond with Irish immigrants arriving, but they really loved Irish music. It became a huge part of 19th century pop culture. And it was almost appropriation in one respect, where they say, we don't really like you, but we love your music. And this was something that we started to see in the 1920s. There was an Irish poet named Thomas Moore who would specifically try to market Irish music to this wider, kind of wealthier Anglo audience, where he'd take traditional Irish songs and then he'd set them to symphonic arrangements that are kind of linking to Handel or Haydn or Corelli. And a lot of Britons and Americans loved that music. So you might be a teenage girl working in this parlor, sweeping the ash out of the fireplace, and you hear the wealthy daughters of this family singing about an Irish experience, about your experience, kind of marketed through these songbooks. They're called Moore's Melodies. But post-famine, again, a lot of women still continue to find work in domestic service. A lot of men continue to find work in mostly outdoor labor. But we also see a large group coming in this period in about the same numbers of the Irish, where by the 1850s, 1860s, 25% of New York's population is Irish-born, and 25% of New York's population is a German-speaking immigrant. So, late 1840s. We have a lot of factors pushing German-speaking immigrants to America, and by the 1850s, about 80% of German-speaking immigrants land right here in New York. There are a number of political rebellions happening in 1848, where essentially in all these different German-speaking states and cities, people are trying to overthrow monarchies to instill democracies. It doesn't work. And so there are a lot of failed revolution leaders who flee to America to escape persecution, and you also have a lot of residents in these spaces coming here as well to escape that general political turmoil. The famine that impacted Ireland is also directly impacting other parts of Europe. In these German-speaking states, the cost of potatoes went up about 400%. As a result, massive grain consumption comes through, about 250 to 300% uptick in grain consumption. There are hunger strikes. And there's also industrialization happening much earlier in Europe than here. So a lot of the people we see coming to New York in this period are artisans. They're German shoemakers and furniture makers, craftsmen, tailors, who were competing with factories to produce the same thing. They come here for more work opportunity and better pay. It's quite a common narrative with a lot of our groups. And upon coming to New York, German men, specifically artisans, dominate those trades, specifically in cabinetry, gilding, woodworking, furniture making. There are also a number of tailors, shoemakers, cigar manufacturers too. And a lot of German women would come and find work, like our Irish women, within domestic service. The difference was that when Irish were coming in the 1840s, at this point they were majority speaking English more than Irish. And there was never really a Little Ireland because there wasn't necessarily this need to form an enclave. 5 Points that was seen as this Irish community was only about 25% Irish. So Irish were living in anywhere where there's affordable work and housing. They're kind of following that all over the city. But with German women, they weren't working for a Protestant native-born New Yorker. They would be working in the home of a German family, a German-American family, and language would largely dictate where they were finding that work. There was also language that contributed to our massive neighborhood of Kleindeutschland. So, kind of dialing back, we have the map and then the detail. By the 1860s, Little Germany was concentrated in the 17th, 11th, 13th, and 10th wards. So it was this massive neighborhood that went from the East River to Bowery, and from Canal Street all the way up to 14th Street by the end of the American Civil War. It's this huge part of New York's economy. And it's called Kleindeutschland in 1848 before Germany is even a country. It doesn't become a country till 1871, but you walk down the street, you're going to hear signs of German, see German around you, and you're going to be entering into what is referred to at that point as Little Germany. That collapses all the diversity of who was finding a community in this neighborhood. You have people coming from 39 different German-speaking states and cities. They have different customs, they have different foodways, different regional dialects, different religions, some are in conflict with each other. And by nature of just now living in this neighborhood, maybe this new identity starts forming that this is this distinctly German-American identity. But within this space, if you're trying to find a community, German immigrants were masters of creating the Verein, the social club. There are hundreds of social clubs for absolutely everything. And maybe you join a social club based off where you're coming from first. If you're from Baden, maybe you're going to join a club of people from Baden. And if you're from Prussia, you're going to join a club of Prussians. Any common ground, there was a club for. There was a Verein that was just for bald-headed men. Right? So it's just like finding any link to this shared community. But then maybe, like as you're here, your identity gets reframed and you think, I don't just like you because you're also from Prussia, I don't just like you because you also are a bald-headed man. Like maybe your identity starts shifting towards hobbies, occupations, political alignments. And some of the widest attended clubs with the most influence were singing societies and athletic societies. And we end up getting one of them right alongside the Treadwells. This is on the left, the Liederkranz Society, which is at 31 East 4th Street, now vacant lot. Merchant's house is like, has this little party wall right here. And I always wonder how this family would have felt about a German singing society right alongside them. Like, if they would stand by that party wall they're sharing and listen to that German music rolling through, or if they would resent it. If they'd be excited about this new change in their community, or if they'd feel like they were losing something that they'd moved into. You also had, on East 4th Street as well, just a couple blocks down, the Turnverein, which was another massive society focused more on athletics. But with the Liederkranz Society, it was at one point, again, kind of looking at, yeah, is that a question or is that stretching? Sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. So with the Liederkranz Society, it spoke again to this larger adoption of elements of culture into American culture. German music, again, was this new sort of musical tradition that was adopted by Americans, where classic songs like Take Me Out to the Ball Game directly mirror 19th century German waltz, that same sort of lilting fashion. When the New York Philharmonic Orchestra got started in the 1840s, half of their musicians were German immigrants. And then by 1900, 89 of the 94 musicians of that orchestra were either German immigrants or German Americans. There's again this very strong musical contribution. And the president of the Liederkranz Society in the 1860s was a very influential fellow named Oswald Ottendorfer. And he was one of these failed revolutionaries who fled Vienna after, again, trying to instill democracy didn't work. He came here, and he did a lot of good for his community. He created the Stadtzeitung, which was a German language newspaper, but published in New York, talking about both news in New York and all these other German states. He also tried to run for mayor in 1874 against Tammany Hall's man, though he failed miserably in that. But there was still an attempt at political engagement, and he was coming with this revolutionary spirit. But he also created one of the first public libraries in the city, the Ottendorfer Library. You've seen it, yeah? It's a beautiful building. It's right on St. Mark's Place, this wonderful Queen Anne kind of building. It was erected in 1884, and it still has the largest circulation of books in German as well. So we do have these physical reminders, these anchors that speak to the German community that really called this place a home and laid down roots within the area. But the next group I'm going to talk about, while it had massive impacts on New York, came in much smaller numbers. And that is Chinese immigration. But I need water first. I feel like I'm talking a mile a minute. Am I talking a mile a minute? I'm sorry. I'll breathe a little bit more. I talk fast, I talk a lot, but Chinese immigration. So, 18th century, after the American Revolution, New York really puts itself on the map with global trade and trade with China by sending out its first ship, 1783, the Empress of China, specifically to trade with Canton. And of course we're looking for silk, spices, porcelain, and the things that America had to trade with China that really facilitate those goods was ginseng and silver. Those were the two things that we really had. And as a result, the first Chinese immigrants we start to see in New York in the 18th century are coming largely because it's just circumstantial with their occupation. A lot were sailors, a lot were longshoremen, some would step off the boat and decide to live in New York as well, so it was a very small population, and it wasn't a migration in this period that was tied to particular turmoil happening in China. That starts to change by the mid-19th century, where you have a lot of foreign influence coming through. You have the Opium Wars 1 and 2 in the mid-19th century, where it's mostly Britain bringing in unfair treaties, creating foreign-led ports, opening up trade throughout all of China, that starts weakening the power of the Qing dynasty. And then adding to that, in the 1850s up to the 1870s, there are a number of civil wars as well, internal conflicts, like the Dungan Revolt and the Taiping Rebellion, mostly religious internal conflicts that in just that 30-year period kill about 20 million people. People fighting the war, but a lot of it was civilian deaths of famine that came about as a result of war. And that's when this migration starts to happen, this deliberate migration in the 1840s. But a lot of Chinese immigrants aren't coming to the east. That's far. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. A lot are coming to the west, because not only is it right there, but the gold rush is happening at that point. And the gold rush has this massive demand for labor, where we start to see Chinese immigrants finding work in mining, in building railroads. The Central Pacific Railroad was built largely using the labor of Chinese contractors. And even after that demand dwindles by the 1850s, a lot of Chinese immigrants start finding work in textiles and cigar manufacturing. But it's at this point, 1850s, where there is a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the West that starts pushing some of those Chinese immigrants to move further east, some of whom were finding a community here in New York. Chinatown that existed wasn't really Chinatown, though. It was in the 6th and 4th wards, again, known as the 5 Points neighborhood. And that's essentially, along the East River by City Hall Park area, and the northern part is extending into Chinatown today. But the population that was there was very small. It was less than 1,000 people. And it was also more of a bachelor society, because a lot of immigrants coming over from China at that point were coming either as single men in contract labor, or men who were married but left their families in China. And to add to that, there were a number of restrictions kind of coming through in immigration that specifically limited a lot of Chinese women coming over as well. 1874, there was a law called the Page Act, which essentially forbid any kind of forced Chinese contract labor and any Chinese woman who was suspected of being a sex worker. And the idea around it was to reduce human trafficking, but the reality was it was very hard as a woman to prove that you weren't something when somebody already made up their mind about what you were. So there were these systems in place that were already really limiting the existence and the creation of Chinese families in this neighborhood, but there were a number of Chinese and Irish families that were developing in 5 Points, just by nature of kind of being within that same neighborhood. But in addition to this kind of growing anti-Chinese sentiment, we also saw this massive commodification of Chinese goods. It was what earned a lot of people in the Bond Street area their fortunes. Astor, in addition to fur trading, dipped into the China trade as well, where he had an inventory of spices and porcelains. And once he, like some other American merchants, didn't want to invest too much silver in that trade, they dabbled in opium too. But in addition to the fortunes that were brought through Chinese goods, there was also not only status symbols that came from things from China, but decorative arts that were an interpretation in some way of an idea of Chinese culture. I have a couple examples. The one on the left is from the Merchant's House, and it's a generic Chinese scene on a porcelain plate. The other thing is from the Metropolitan Museum, but it's an example of chinoiserie. This sort of Western interpretation of Chinese court culture, an adoption of aesthetics that became wildly popular at this point. And within, again, the homes of these patrician New Yorkers, if you have Chinese porcelain, if you have things inspired by Chinese decorative arts, that is, again, a status symbol in a way. But it's this complicated relationship of romanticizing a pseudo-idea of a culture and exotifying a culture, while at the same time having a malice and a resentment towards the people from that culture. And it was these ideas that ended up leading to the country's first ban on immigration based off place of origin and based off race, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this is a couple of clips from the New York Times kind of talking about the navigation, the ins and outs of that law. But essentially, before 1882, there wasn't any kind of restriction of who was allowed into the country and who wasn't based off place of origin. Essentially, barring a criminal record or contagious disease, you showed up unchallenged. But in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act barred all migration from China and anyone of Chinese descent, unless you held a certain occupation, mostly being a merchant, a diplomat, or a teacher. And if people were traveling or were students, they were also exempt from that exclusion. But it was meant to be a temporary law that on the side, ooh, that's scary. Battery power's low. Oh no! I don't know what to do with that. So I might have to use a lot of verbal description. But no Chinese for 10 years. The law was supposed to expire in 10 years. One of the justifications was concern over labor competition, and the idea was the labor population is going to stabilize in 10 years, and then the border will be opened up again for Chinese immigration. But every 10 years, when it was set to expire, it was renewed over and over again until it was made a permanent fixture in 1902. And that Exclusion Act wasn't really repealed in full until 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, which also had done away with decades of quota laws placed on immigration, really that started to come about in the 20th century, that were heralded by that original Exclusion Act, and essentially centered around conversations people were having about what they wanted future Americans to look like. But when we see Chinatown as we see it today in Manhattan, it doesn't really develop to the size that it did until after 1965. It's a very new development because of those restrictions. But still, Chinese immigrants had this very small but significant presence in New York. And our next stop is going to look at a group that was coming in massive numbers and moving into a neighborhood that quickly became one of the most densely populated in the entire world, and that is Russian Jewish immigration. At this period, like the Irish, the factors that kind of led up to Russian Jewish immigration in the 1880s were based off decades of discrimination and repression. I have, on the left side, a map of basically the boundary of where Russian Jews were permitted to live starting in 1791. It was called the Pale of Settlement. It was about 4% of Imperial Russia, and it mostly included modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus. And by 1885, essentially, if you were living outside the Pale of Settlement as a Jewish resident of Russia, you're getting evicted from your towns, you're getting evicted from rural areas, and being required to live within this very narrow boundary. By 1885, there are about 4 million Russian Jews living within this area. Lower East Side. That's Hester Street in 1903. It also earns the name as the Jewish Lower East Side, which, like Chinatown, like Little Germany, collapses the diversity within that neighborhood. It was largely Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, Yiddish-speaking, but there was a small percentage of Sephardic Jews from Portugal, from Spain, and there was also a very small number of Greek Jews, Roman-Yot, who spoke Greek as well. But within this neighborhood, there were kind of two major industries. A lot of Jewish men found work largely as merchants, where about 1 out of every 6 Jewish men was a merchant, with 2/3 of them owning push carts. That you would walk down Orchard Street and they would just throng the street. Where you're selling everything. You're selling food and dishware and clothing, and nothing has a price. Right? Everything's haggling. Right? And as a result, I mean, if your rent is $10 a month, you shave off pennies with each purchase. It might be making your rent or not making your rent. So it really was a vital way to shop in the neighborhood, and it grew to be this massive market for working class families. But another thing that was existing in that neighborhood was the emergence of the garment industry, where we started to shift away from having a tailor make custom fit clothes for an individual and more towards standardized sizing within department stores. And initially, that garment industry was, at first, an avenue for Jewish immigrants coming because it needed this massive labor force, and this was kind of the pattern of immigration happening in that period. But it also allowed for a flexibility of hours. Because in the beginnings of this industry, in the 1880s, 1890s, there wasn't year-long labor space you were going to. You weren't going to a factory like uptown, like we come to think of when we think of factories. You were going to someone's apartment, where maybe 1/3 of that apartment was devoted to work during the day, where you'd work as a contract labor, part of this long process, where some contractors were cutting the patterns for the dresses, some were stitching them together, some were ironing them out and sending them back to the manufacturers. And it was through this kind of contract system that a lot of people found their work. And 90% of the employees in the garment industry in the late 19th century were Jewish immigrants. And as a contractor, you know, even though you're working in an apartment where it is crowded and you're working a 60-hour work week and it's hot and it's dense, there was also a flexibility of hours. Because if you were working in a factory run by a Protestant New Yorker, you would have to adhere to the American work week of Monday to Saturday. But as Jewish families with the Sabbath falling on Saturday, as a contractor, you could have Saturday off for observance and work on Sunday because you are creating your own hours and have that flexibility. That was something always being threatened, in that if a contractor, you didn't make the 100 dress you had to make that week by Friday afternoon, you would very well work through Saturday. But there was that option for flexibility. And by turn of the 20th century, about 70% of women's clothing and 40% of men's sold in the entire country was manufactured right in the Lower East Side. It was massive. And the garment industry was really part of that neighborhood all the way up to 9/11, 2001. It was a presence. But we started to see these clothes being sent out to, department stores. This one's an image of the Wanamaker Annex building, which is now the Kmart building. But it became folded into the Wanamaker department store in 1903. And very well, maybe this is where they're having those standardized size clothing being sold to middle-class New Yorkers. And at this period, by the time this building goes up, you also see a shift as far as what the factories look like. And those factories start to shift away from a room in an apartment to what we come to think of when we think of factories. These big expansive floors, a lot of windows, dozens of sewing machines. And the push for that was precipitated by steel-framed high-rise buildings, where there was this big building boom in the turn of the 20th century, where more and more of these are going up. And manufacturers look at those buildings and find it cost-effective to rent out a couple floors of those and use those as factories instead. And all of those buildings have electricity as well. So they can adopt the brand new electric sewing machine that these smaller tenement apartments could not. And so as a result, you do see a shift in what those working conditions look like, as well as who's working in them. Still largely dominated by Jewish immigrants, but mostly teenage girls, around 16 to 24 years old or so. And within those spaces, there's some benefits in that they are more open. You're also hanging out with a bunch of other 16-year-old girls, right? So maybe there's also a peer group that forms as a result, but you're still working 60-hour weeks about. At this point, you do have to adhere to the American work week of Monday to Saturday. In some of these spaces, not only are they very unsafe buildings that don't have a lot of regulation, but there's a lot of contention. If you want to sit at your own sewing machine in some factories, you have to rent your own chair. And these conversations started to boil within these spaces. And that's when we start to see labor unions start to organize. Because it's a big building, these factories, there's a large workforce, and it's easy to access people and have those conversations, as opposed to when they were tucked away in these small back corners of apartments where you couldn't really access them. And there were a number of labor movements that happened in this neighborhood in the early 20th century that also would have played a huge role in what was taking place in the Bond Street area. I don't have a picture of the first one, but Clara Lemlich was a 23-year-old girl who was working at Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And in 1909, she came to Cooper Union, and she gave a rousing speech in Yiddish to her peers. And she inspired women working in all of these factories around New York to leave their factory, to petition to reduce their work week to 52 hours. They wanted clothes shops to hire only union members. They wanted increased wages. And it was very inspirational because she inspired 20,000 women to leave those factories. It was the largest strike of women to date in 1909. And it was always kind of an element of her character, too. Like, when she was much older, she was at a nursing home, and she even got the orderlies to organize. So it was always something that Clara had, like, on her mind. But this 1909 strike shut down the garment industry for about 3 months. And some factories did take back the women on their terms, but many did not. And many people, again, had to go once again into the conditions they rallied against. The next year, in 1910, there was another strike that was much larger, and that's what I have a little newspaper clipping of here. It was the cloakmaker strike of about 50,000 people leaving their factories. And this strike was launched from the Labor Lyceum on 64 East 4th Street, so right in the neighborhood. And like Clara Lemlich, they were petitioning to reduce their work week this time to 48 hours. They wanted, again, shops to hire only union members. At this point, the strikers were about 90% men, only 10% of them were women. And the demographics were still about 2/3 Jewish immigrants, 1/3 Italian immigrants. But within a month of this massive strike, it starts to stagger. And a lot of it is because of scab laborers who are sneaking back to work right in the Catskills. And on August of 1910, there was a skirmish that happened outside 85 East 4th Street, right across from the Lyceum, where Union members ended up getting in a skirmish with these scab laborers. One person did end up dying of his injuries. His name was Herman Moskowitz. He was a father of 5 children. And it spoke to kind of these complicated challenges of rallying to get these improved conditions within this neighborhood, but also having to navigate survival as well, where eventually you have a family support, you have to support yourself, and you very well would have to go back into those same conditions you tried to fight against. And the last thing that kind of happens within this 3-year period that ends up prompting a more earnest look at the conditions of factories is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is a photograph that showed up on the New York World in 1911. And it happened 15 minutes to the end of the day on March 25th in a garment factory. So you have refuse everywhere. It spread very quickly. And it led to a huge loss of life, again, of mostly being these teenage girls. The fire escapes hadn't been inspected in years, so girls who tried to escape onto them, the fire escape pulled away from the wall. Many who tried to flee down stairwells found that a lot of the doors to get out had been locked, as they had always been locked to keep employees from sneaking out on cigarette breaks, as well as to keep labor union organizers out. And it led to a loss of 146 people, again, mostly being these teenagers. And the men who ran the factory ended up getting off not guilty because they had technically broken no laws. The defense used in their favor was one of both xenophobia and misogyny, the hysteria defense, that said that these were young teenage immigrant women, they were hysterical, they were responsible for their own deaths because they made it worse than it was, they jumped out the windows. And so as a result, there wasn't really justice done for these women, but it did spearhead a huge call in reform and improving factory conditions and workers' rights. Because the building it took place in is a little out of the boundary of what we're talking about. It's right by Washington Square Park, NYU's Brown Building, but it happened in a prominent spot in New York City, where you had all of these influential people in that park. They see this fire go up. Had the factory happened, or the fire happened in a neighborhood like the Lower East Side, it may have been seen more as a tenement problem, right, rather than a New York problem. But as a result, this did end up leading to a push and reform for improving factory conditions and workers' rights, but unfortunately at the expense of 146 people. And again, the demographic of those rallying against were mostly Jewish, but we are going to look at our last group that ends up coming a little later on, early 20th century, has a huge role within the garment industry, but also in many others, and that is Italian immigration. We start to see Italian immigration happen in large numbers, really in the 1910s or so. But the influence of Italian art and culture is very much felt in New York by the mid-19th century. 1843, we get this opera house, Palmo's Opera House, which is again on the boundary of our neighborhood, more in lower Manhattan by Chambers Street. But it was created by an Italian immigrant named Ferdinand Palmo, who wanted to really allow Italian opera to have a foothold in the city and really keep it alive. So he creates this 800-seat theater, but unfortunately for Palmo, it's a little bit of a commercial failure. In 1848, it ends up changing hands, becomes Burton Theater, and within it there are a number of other theatrical productions that are not focused in Italian opera. And one of the possible reasons people cited for the reason of its failure was that it was not a building that had the grandeur that was suited for Italian opera. Where, again, like having Chinese goods within your home or having, again, decorative arts inspired by Chinese court culture, Italian opera was a status symbol. And the hard-backed wooden benches of Palmo's was not exactly a lap of luxury for the clientele who would be going to see Italian opera. So what we get instead is the Astor Opera Theater on the right here. Now where the Starbucks is by Astor Place, because that's what happens in New York. But it was brought up in 1847, and for the next 5 years, the people who funded it really promised to keep Italian opera alive in it. Its first production was an Italian opera Ernani, and it not only was a cultural status for people in the neighborhood, but you also saw arts leaving the theaters and entering the home as far as, again, decorative arts, what you were having in your home as a wealthy New Yorker. We have two things from the merchant's house that are in no way connected to it being made in Italy or really representing an authentic scene in Italy. There's a porcelain bowl with an Italian scene from 1825 to 1835, and then we have this generic river painting of a European scene that references nowhere in Europe. It's just kind of like taking elements of it, but essentially having these sort of generic depictions of these beautiful European countrysides. It was like an expensive postcard. You know, your neighbors come in and they say, oh, you have this Italian scene, you're so worldly and traveled, and you could get that painting in Union Square. But it's serving the same kind of purpose. And this romanticization of the Italian countryside, Italian art and culture, also was put forward in guidebooks that were sold to Americans in the 1840s about traveling Europe. There was one written by a man named Bayard Taylor in 1846 called Views Afoot, or Europe with Knapsack and Staff. And essentially he wrote about, it was like a travel log around Europe, visiting Ireland, visiting Amsterdam as well. He also visited Italy. And with Italy, he waxed poetic about the landscape and the history of the place. But even though there was this commodification and appropriation of this idea of Italian culture, there wasn't so much of an interest of the realities of Italians at that point. Because, I'll cut right to this. This was something from his book, talking specifically about how beautiful the land is, but characterizing Italians as, in very negative ways, anywhere from being lazy and deceitful to malicious and bloodthirsty. And what he wrote of his trip to Italy was this dark shadow in the moral atmosphere of Italy hangs like a curse on her beautiful soil, weakening the sympathies of citizens of freer lands with her fallen condition. And it's nasty. And it was a mindset not only extending to Italian people, but Italian immigrants that would later arrive to New York as well. But the conditions of Italy, really in the late 19th century, there's a lot of factors kind of laying upon the lead to this migration. The first is Italy's unified in 1871, northern Italy and southern Italy. And as a result, the unification brings a lot of overcrowding, specifically within southern regions. Italy's economy was largely agricultural as well, but most of the residents there, only 10% of them own their own land. And as that land becomes increasingly more crowded after the unification, as taxes start going up, you have, again, disenfranchisement. In the 1870s, only 2% of Italy's population could vote, could participate politically, and it was mostly the wealthy, the aristocracy. And there wouldn't be universal marriage suffrage over the age of 20 until 1918, and for women, 1945. So this was long-standing. But to add to political trauma, to add to overcrowding, there were also a number of natural disasters that were taking place in the turn of the 20th century as well. Late 19th century too. In 1890, there was a parasite that wiped out the majority of the grapevines in southern Italy. You also had the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1906 and the subsequent earthquakes around it that killed about 2,000 Italians. In 1908, there was an earthquake and a tidal wave that hit Italy and killed 150,000. And as the population increased, as industrialization started increasing along with it, there was a lot of forests being cut down for timber, which led to soil erosion, which led to the creation of swamplands, which led to malaria outbreaks. There was also massive shortage of food as well, and also a lack of economic opportunity. Where in the 1910s, 1920s, a carpenter in Italy who's making $1.80 a week there, doing the exact same line of work in America could make $18 a week. So there's this massive push factor. But from about the 1880s to 1914, there were 4 million Italians that came to this country, but they often didn't come to stay. Unlike we saw with Eastern European Jewish immigrants, for instance, who are coming in a chain migration, usually the head of household coming first, sending money home, saving up enough to bring the rest of his family over, but with the intention that the entire family will be brought over and will be here to stay. With Italian immigrants, it was usually men coming over, again in contract labor, with the idea of being here for seasonal work, making money, going back to Italy to pay off debts, to put a down payment on land or business or to support family. And about 40% of Italians who came to New York would always kind of go back to Italy, kind of back and forth. And there wasn't really a long-standing Italian population who came to stay until after World War I or so. But at that point, there were a lot of Italian neighborhoods that were flourishing. And essentially, from Soho to Washington Square Park, there was this kind of sweep of massive Italian neighborhoods. 25% of America's Italian population found home in New York. And you also had a small pocket of Italians living up on the East Harlem kind of area of Manhattan as well. But the most popularized neighborhood is what remains of Little Italy, kind of around Mott and Mulberry Street. And there was a lot of depictions of it as well in media that, again, may have been read by our residents in the Bond Street area. Jacob Riis really kind of popularized the idea of muckraking journalism, of tenement photography. He, in a way, brought to light conditions that not everyone, especially kind of our wealthy, influential figures of New York, were privy to. I actually really love this picture. I think it has a really great tonal element to it. But it's called Bandit's Roost on Mulberry Street. And sometimes Riis would just come into apartments or alleyways and take a picture, and it was very candid, but others were posed. And this is a deliberately staged photograph with icons that our readers of How the Other Half Lives would absolutely identify. Like, man with the bowler here would often be categorized as a gang member in the area. This man with a shotgun as well. All these menacing figures kind of leaning out the windows. Riis described Mulberry Bend, this neighborhood of Little Italy, as being the foul core of New York slums, the most vile in the world. And his narrative is kind of this contrast of judgment, but also sympathy. It is definitely kind of looking upon the residents of this neighborhood with a sense of victimhood. And that was because he was trying to enact change and bring about, shifts in housing, shifts in sanitation. But it also, again, collapses the nuance of the neighborhood and what life was like in working class neighborhoods. There was another woman named Charlotte Adams, another journalist, who provided an alternative view to Riis's photographs, where she admitted that some of the houses in Little Italy were indeed kind of falling into disrepair, they were sordid, but she also talked about all the picturesque homes she saw through the curtain of people's windows, with a pot of lilacs on the table, or prints of saints on freshly printed plaster, fringed paper lining shelves and mantels with painted plates on them. And so even though this kind of work did a lot of good, there was also dehumanization that came from the specific kind of photojournalism, and didn't always look at the fact that within these neighborhoods reflected there were communities, and there were families, and there were businesses, and it was a place where people were putting down roots as well. But because these were published, they were largely the popularized image of the neighborhoods, and it did lead to sanitation and all these shifts. But it also created this enduring idea, not only of maybe our residents of Bond Street and how they're perceiving residents of this neighborhood, but also an idea today about when you think of the word tenement, or when you think of the word the Lower East Side of the early 20th century, maybe a Jacob Riis photograph comes to mind, of overcrowding, of foul streets. But there's always other layers to that narrative. And the influence of people within this neighborhood in the 19th century absolutely felt, whether it was in the institutions they created or the cultural contributions to the music our tenants of Bond Street were listening to. And that influence exists today, not only in the patterns that came before, but also in New York within our present. As of 2017, about 40% of New York City's population was born in another country. And at this point, there's our largest numbers are from the Dominican Republic and China. That's kind of the largest demographics. And in some ways, these narratives are mirrored and shared at the narratives of 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and all that really changes is the language that those narratives are told in. But I think it's interesting and important to kind of walk through this city and see where that contribution continues. And see where this story, while it was shaped by people in the 1850s and 60s and 70s when that was their present, it's a story that continues to be shaped by us today in our present. And the question is just like, where do you want the story to go? Because it is this continuing narrative that is always going to be a massive element of New York City's history, and one that is kind of shared by all of us. But I've talked for an hour, a lot.